Can we get the cupcake? Minister wants a cupcake. So we're joined by Ed Vaizey, who is the Minister at DCMS, on the day of the announcement of the Community Radio Order. Can you tell us why there was a need for a Community Radio Order?
So it's been a long time coming. A lot of people in the community radio community have been asking me for quite a while now, when am I going to get round to publishing this paper? So I'm very pleased that today we are publishing the paper. We did a consultation, a review on the ways that community radio could raise money. So we have, I think, a pretty successful community radio ecology, if you like, around the United Kingdom, more than 200 community radio stations, but they're not for profit, and they have strict rules about how they can raise money to run themselves, because commercial radio obviously looks over its shoulder and says we don't want to have unfair competition from their perspective. So we've reviewed the way that community radio can raise money, and we've said that community radio stations can now raise more money from commercial sponsorship, provided they remain as not-for-profit organisations. And we've also said that we can renew their licences more easily, because obviously people invest a lot of time and love in community radio stations, and they don't want too much bureaucracy.
Let's deal with the commercial revenue side to start with. What you were articulating then sounds like was before the full practicality of the arrival of community radio, sort of 10 odd years ago, when the commercial radio sector was all-encompassing. What's changed about the landscape of local broadcasting that is the background then to your decision to relax some of the financial strictures, or at least in terms of commercial revenue in the community sector?
Well, I think the proof of the pudding is always in the eating. So when you bring forward a new innovation, it was the last government that brought forward the idea of community radio, so all credit to them for doing that. But obviously, if you're running a commercial radio station, and I think we should remember that commercial radio stations, it's not a license to print money. That's also a very tough business. They would naturally say, well, hold on, you're creating a whole new set of radio stations that could potentially compete with us. We need to get advertising from businesses to run our business and so on. So initially, there were quite tough restrictions on how much money community radio stations could raise. But I think we've seen over the last 10 years or so that community radio stations can exist alongside commercial radio stations. I think they serve different purposes. The audience for a community radio station like the one we're in, WCR FM, will serve a more local community. It will also provide more sort of training opportunities for people who are learning how to be radio presenters or learning how to be radio technicians. So they serve a more social purpose, and I don't think they threaten the revenues of commercial radio stations. So we want to give them more flexibility, community radio stations, more flexibility to raise money.
Sounds like there's a sort of deregulatory ethos going on here. Why not go the whole hog? What is superior about commercial radio that it needs any kind of protection?
Well, I think that's a fair question from your point of view. I think there is still a lot of regulation surrounding even commercial radio. They still work around certain constraints, and they too do lobby government to say, can you remove some of the constraints? For example, we still have format rules so that commercial radio stations are designated as, a pop station or a talk station, and they have to fulfill certain requirements. But I think it's important that when you make changes, you proceed relatively cautiously, because we want commercial radio to thrive, we want community radio to do well as well, and we want to also keep these two parts, as it were, of the radio community walking hand in hand, if you like, step by step. So I can certainly understand why some people say, come on, this is ludicrous, get rid of all this regulation, and I'm sure those arguments will continue. But at the moment I'm happy with where we are, but we're always open to people recommending other changes.
You began our conversation by citing funding challenges as being sort of predominantly in the psyche of our sector and how we look about it from the future. And there's going to be a lot of scrutiny of the community radio order from that respect. How do you see the funding challenges being met, and how can the government help? Because although the relaxing of restrictions is clearly going to be very helpful for those stations that's had no capacity at all to have commercial revenue, And it could be helpful for some of the more advanced, if you like, business models in terms of commercial revenue, which are knocking on the door of the threshold, and that threshold has clearly gone up. But what is proposed in the community radio order is not by any means a full funding solution for the challenges faced by our sector. And let's just take a bit of a side look there for a second. You've got the 40 million roughly has been allocated to community TV. You've got the 21 million allocated for the the commercial radio digital switchover, to say nothing of the licence fee, which is raised for the BBC, I think in the region of 140 million, just less, spent on local radio in this country. And yet we're in the realm of hovering just above 300,000 for the Community Radio Fund. So this question, which is turning into the longest question in the history of long questions, is not about we're looking to the government to completely resolve this, but how do you, as somebody I know who's interested in community radio and community media and what we're trying to do, how do you see the government being able to help in these funding challenges?
Well, it was a long question, but I think you made some very valid and important points, and I think you have to look at all of these both individually but also in the round. So to a certain extent, taking some of your points bit by bit. I mean, clearly with local television is a new innovation, and television is more expensive than radio, and we have effectively sort of pump-primed it. So there's a substantial amount of money up front to ensure that we can get local television off the ground, but we certainly see local television in the future as being self-financing. So it's a short-term deal. In terms of digital switchover and the £21 million you mentioned, only 7 million of that comes from government. The rest comes from the BBC and from commercial radio. But that is to build a digital radio infrastructure, which will help commercial radio, and it could also help potentially community radio, because we're looking at how we can help small stations to get onto a digital platform. So we've put some money aside with Ofcom, the media regulator, to look at how we do that. And then, of course, there's the big question of the BBC and its presence in radio. The BBC has a big presence. I think 2/3 of radio listening is with the BBC, but hopefully the digital radio platform, funnily enough, will provide some good competition, because at the moment, as you know, it's difficult to get a national FM slot. So all of that is fair enough. We've maintained, as far as we can, the sort of central government grant for community radio, although it is a small amount of money. We've continued to look at issuing new licences. We have, as we're doing today, continue to look at how we can relax the funding restrictions on community radio. So we want to help where we can. But again, without wishing to sort of cop out too much, I think your points are valid points. There's an election coming up. There'll be a new government after the election. Hopefully it'll be us. And, we'll take a fresh look at this, because I do think you're quite right to point out the funding challenges of community radio and the difficulties that it's faced. And I think we should, as a government, recognise that, from my perspective, community radio has been a really big success. It really has. 200 stations. You come somewhere like here in Wolverhampton or Swindon, near my constituency, and you see really passionate people doing an amazing job and involving their whole community. Not just the people who volunteer to work here and get trained as a result, but all the people who get a voice through this station. So I think you're quite right to keep agitating for more money.
Okay. The Community Radio Fund is in itself a pump primary, if you like. It is primarily there to inject into community broadcasters so that they can build a business model that then sustains itself. If the government at this point are not committing to increasing that fund, how do you, as the minister with this portfolio, how do you see the government maybe being helpful in working with the Community Media Association, for instance, to get that fund up? Because originally that fund was 500,000 for under 15 community radio stations. There's now well in excess of 200 licenses, to say nothing of other community media organisations not in the licensing system. So do you see yourself as having a role in ongoing negotiations with us in which we can work together, even if the funding isn't directly from government, to get those funds up?
Yeah, well, I'm obviously happy to work with the Community Media Association, and it is a difficult argument in some respects, because clearly, on the one hand, you're saying community radio should get more money from government, but on the other hand, we're seeing we've seen a massive growth in community radio, and community radio doing pretty well with something like 200.
The thing is, our sector is failing and succeeding in the more licenses, but each year Ofcom are publishing a report which shows that the average turnover for a licensed community station is dropping. That indicates the sector is failing. So something's got to happen. If this government cannot commit to increasing the fund directly, is there not a way that we can work together to find some sort of third-party investment into community radio?
I'm sure there is, and I'm open to all ideas, and I'm not saying that we wouldn't increase the fund in the future, but all these funding decisions take place, from my perspective as a minister in the Department of Culture. We work with the Treasury about what funds are available, and as you can imagine, there are a lot of call on government money in terms of the organisations we represent, from museums to performing arts venues to radio stations. But certainly my heart is with community radio, and I'm always open to arguments both about the level of direct funding from government, but also, as you say, working with third parties, and people can work out who the likely third parties might be that would help community radio. So if there are practical ideas coming from the Community Media Association, I would certainly listen to them and look to take forward those I thought had a realistic prospect of success. OK,
I'll be calling you tomorrow morning. You've got an opportunity now. You've mentioned the election. You mentioned you might have a refreshed look. May the 8th, you say you're still the minister with this portfolio. How do you see a future Conservative or Conservative-led coalition being able to... what would you do with a refreshed look to our sector?
Well, I think... I was passionate about ensuring that we kept the grant when we came into government, even though it's been reduced. We were facing a lot of funding pressure because we had to make the cuts that obviously people are very well aware of. So, if you're looking, you are literally looking through the books, seeing where you can save money, as I'm sure the local council is here. So I was adamant that we had to keep some funding for community radio. One of the first orders we made was to change... to give more flexibility to community radio to raise money. That was done 4 or 5 years ago. So this is the second time we've come back to the issue to look at it. So we've kept in touch, as it were, with community radio and looked at how we can help. I think any incoming government would have to look at radio in the whole. So you'd have BBC Charter Review looking at the BBC's presence, particularly in local radio. We're making great progress in terms of digital radio, but again, a new government would have to say, right, this is where we are with digital radio. Do we have a realistic plan for this government, for the next parliament, for the next 5 years to transform Britain's radio network into a fully digital network? And within that mix also has to come community radio. So I think a smart move would be to look at the whole radio scene and to ensure, I think, that community radio isn't seen as merely a sort of add-on, an afterthought, a nice to have, there, here you go, you carry on doing that, but actually an integral part of the radio network. Because the other thing I think we need to remember is, although we all bang on about how particularly young people are now changing their listening habits and viewing habits, and people are listening to music streaming services or obviously using their smartphones much more, we still are a radio listening nation, and we love radio in this country, and it's important that we look at all parts of that radio network, if you like, and ensure that it's as healthy as it can be.
Okay, what I'm picking up from that is a holistic approach, which we would certainly welcome. One of the developing aspects of local broadcasting is how the BBC is and might work together in the future with local community broadcasters. How do you see that relationship developing, and indeed what would you want to do to chivvy it along?
Well, that is a question I should probably dodge, in the sense that we have made it very clear that we're not going to... so the BBC has a charter from government which lasts for 10 years, and this charter will run out at the end of 2016. and there's a process when you renew the charter, which we would renew, end of 2016, beginning of 2017. There's a process leading up to that, which is called charter review by the aficionados. And we've said that we will start charter review on, day one after the election, but we're not going to, have a debate about the BBC before then, in the sense of setting out our stall or saying what we think should happen to the BBC. But clearly, having said all that, I think it is a perfectly, as I've said earlier in this interview about many of your points, it's a perfectly valid argument to say that the BBC's relationship, particularly local BBC stations, with community radio is something worth discussing. And to give you a parallel, for example, local newspapers, which have obviously faced their own difficulties in the last 10 years because of the way technology has disrupted them through classified ads going online and also through people getting their news from different sources, they too put a strong argument, well, not an argument, but they too raise the issue, saying if the BBC is a big regional and local media player, and so are we, what ways can we look at how we work together with the BBC? So really what I'm saying is a general principle. Yes, there is clearly a debate about the BBC locally and regionally and its relationship with other local media players, whether that's local newspapers, local commercial radio stations or community radio stations.
Okay. Well, I think as that relationship develops, we have to find ways of being a mutually beneficial resource to each other. For the BBC seeing value on an equal status with the community sector, and us looking to them to capitalise on their the commercial term, but to build on what they can offer by in terms of resources, skills, expertise. Toss something out there for you. Why doesn't the BBC Academy put together a national news offer for the community sector, which could then not necessarily buy in, but part of the partnership would be offered national and international news to complement what community radio stations are doing locally, as opposed to having to buy in from the only provider for that service, which is IRN, owned by Sky. Just a thought, we might return to that. Part of the community radio order very much is what happens at the end of the second 5-year licence term. Now, you're announcing today that there's actually just going to be a rollover. In other words, the arrangements will continue for the third 5-year term. Why? And I'm not necessarily saying you should have done this, but I'm just interested to know why you didn't open it for competitive tender in the third term.
Well, we consulted very widely on this, so in a sense our decision reflects the views that we garnered from community radio and other players. And I think we essentially took the view that a competitive tendering process in community radio, where a lot of radio stations, these are not commercial organisations, these are not-for-profit organisations, and although there might be others who, in a particular local area, who might like to have a crack at running a community radio station and therefore getting the licence, we feel that because of the low levels of funding, the difficulties of raising money, that to impose, as it were, a competitive tendering exercise on community radio stations, which would cost the incumbents some money and potentially those who wanted to challenge for the licence, would be an unnecessary expense. And we certainly didn't get any impression that there was an appetite from people who didn't have licences, as it were, to have a competitive tendering process to allow them to get in on the game.
Okay, you have touched on this subject, but one of the reasons when these discussions were taking place around about 5 years ago for rolling over the first term was to see how the arrival of low-cost digital platforms came. And there's been some delays on that. And how do you see that informing and the emphasis here is going to be in low cost, isn't it? Because we've already identified considerable funding challenges for the sector. So how do you see the arrival of low cost digital platforms influencing the community sector, and can we say for sure whether they will arrive during this third 5-year term?
Well, obviously, I assume it's the case with WCR-FM that people can listen to community radio on the internet anyway, although that's not necessarily the most convenient way, and most people want to listen to radio while they're sort of doing something else in the house or driving around. In terms of the digital network and having digital radios and digital stations, more and more people are listening to the radio on digital radio. More and more digital-only stations are having a big impact. Six Music, the BBC's station, is the most famous example of that, where the latest figures appear to show that it's overtaken Radio 3 in terms of its listenership, but it's a radio station you can only listen to on digital. Now, the big challenge here is that we can very easily get the national stations onto digital. That's not a big problem. And broadly speaking, we can get the big regional radio stations onto digital. But the challenge is for smaller independent commercial radio and for community radio stations to get a platform onto digital, because it's an expensive platform to be on. So what we asked Ofcom to do, and we gave them some money to do this research, was to look at low-cost transmitters that a small community radio station or a small independent radio station could use to get onto a digital network. And those tests are ongoing. They're well underway. So I would imagine, yes, in the next 2 or 3 years, possibly less time, we will have a fully viable option, should people choose to take it up, to allow particularly a smaller independent commercial radio station to get onto digital at a cost that falls within its kind of what it can achieve.
Okay, we've met before. I know that you get community radio. Encapsulate in sort of one sentence maybe what you think the real value of community broadcasting into the wider landscape traditionally and exclusively occupied by the BBC and commercial networks.
The value is in the title, community. Community radio stations are genuinely local. They genuinely involve a very wide range of people from the community in a way that is not really viable for commercial radio stations who cover a larger footprint. So I would say that community radio's value is in its passion, the opportunities it gives for people to participate in the running of a radio station, and the voice it gives to many different parts of the community who wouldn't otherwise get airtime.
Ed Vaizey, many thanks for talking to the Community Media Association.
Thank you very much.